African Nanny noticed hidden cameras in the Arab CEO's home. What she did for his daughter shocked him. A young woman from Ghana named Asha stepped into the marble foyer of the most luxurious penthouse she had ever seen. Her worn suitcase a stark contrast to the gleaming surfaces that surrounded her. She had traveled 8,000 miles to work as a nanny for Ahmed al-Rashid, a petroleum billionaire whose wealth could buy small countries. The agency had warned her that he was demanding, controlling, that previous nannies rarely lasted more than a few months. What they hadn't told her was about the cameras, dozens of them, hidden in every corner, watching, recording, violating the privacy of everyone who lived within these walls. And they certainly hadn't told her about Layla, Ahmed's 7-year-old daughter, whose silence spoke louder than screams, whose eyes held secrets that would shatter a father's carefully constructed world. Asha had been cleaning houses in Accra since she was 14, sending every spare sati to her younger siblings so they could attend university, something she had sacrificed for their dreams. At 25, she was intelligent enough to have been a teacher or a nurse, but circumstances had carved a different path for her, one that led to the employment agency that specialized in placing African women in wealthy Middle Eastern households. The pay was 10 times what she could earn in Ghana, enough to transform her family's future. But the cost was measured in loneliness, homesickness, and the particular vulnerability that came with being completely dependent on an employer's mercy. She had heard the stories: passports confiscated, wages withheld, women trapped in golden cages with no way home. But her brother's medical school tuition was due, and desperation makes people brave in ways that comfort never could. Ahmed al-Rashid had built his empire on oil and control, turning the black gold beneath the desert sand into a fortune that placed him among the 100 richest men in the world. His penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a Manhattan skyscraper, a testament to power that could reshape skylines and influence governments. He moved through life with the calculated precision of someone who had never met a problem that money couldn't solve, never encountered a person who couldn't be bought or intimidated. His wife had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving him alone to raise Layla, though raise was perhaps too generous a term for the relationship between a father who communicated through bank transfers and a daughter who had learned that love was something other children had. Ahmed's solution to parenting was surveillance. Cameras that monitored every room, every conversation, every moment of his daughter's life. Layla was 7 years old and hadn't spoken in 6 months. The other nannies had reported this to Ahmed as a behavioral problem, something that could be fixed with stricter discipline or expensive therapy sessions. They saw a difficult child, a spoiled rich girl acting out for attention. None of them had bothered to look deeper, to see the way Layla flinched when doors closed too loudly, how she positioned herself near exits in every room, how she drew pictures of houses with no windows and families where the father figure was always turned away. The child psychiatrists Ahmed hired spoke in clinical terms about selective mutism and trauma response, but they attended their sessions in his office, surrounded by the same cameras that recorded Layla's every vulnerable moment. The little girl had learned that privacy was an illusion, that safety was temporary, and that the adults who were supposed to protect her were often the source of her greatest fear. Asha discovered the first camera on her second day, hidden behind a decorative plant in Layla's bedroom. Then another in the bathroom, disguised as a smoke detector. By the end of her first week, she had identified 17 different recording devices throughout the apartment, each one a violation of basic human dignity, each one a reminder that she was being watched, judged, evaluated like a laboratory specimen. The other staff members, the cook, the housekeeper, the security guards, moved through the apartment with a practiced indifference of people who had accepted that privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. They warned Asha in whispers that Ahmed reviewed the footage every night, that previous employees had been fired for infractions as minor as making personal phone calls or spending too much time in the bathroom. The cameras weren't just surveillance. They were a form of psychological control that kept everyone in a state of constant anxiety. But Asha noticed something the cameras couldn't capture: the way Layla's breathing changed when her father was in the room, how the little girl seemed to shrink into herself whenever Ahmed's voice echoed through the apartment. She saw how Layla positioned her stuffed animals like sentries around her bed, creating barriers against threats only she could see. During their first week together, Asha spoke to Layla in English, Arabic, and even basic French, trying to find a language that might unlock the silence. It was only when she began humming a Ghanaian lullaby her own mother had sung to her that Layla looked up from her coloring book, her dark eyes wide with something that might have been recognition. The little girl reached out tentatively and touched Asha's hand, the first voluntary contact she had made with another human being in months. In that touch, Asha felt the electric connection of two souls recognizing their shared need for gentleness in a world that had forgotten how to be soft. The breakthrough came during Layla's third week with Asha, when the little girl finally spoke. Not words, but a whispered hum that matched the Ghanaian melody Asha sang while braiding her hair. They were sitting in the sunroom, the late afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Central Park, when Layla suddenly grabbed Asha's arm and pointed toward a camera hidden in the corner. "He watches," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse but clear as crystal. "He watches when I sleep. He watches when I cry. He watches when the other ladies hurt me." The words hit Asha like physical blows, each syllable a revelation that made her stomach clench with protective fury. She pulled Layla close, shielding her from the camera's electronic gaze, and felt the little girl's body shake with the relief of finally being believed, finally being heard by someone who wouldn't dismiss her truth as childish imagination. That night, Asha couldn't sleep. She lay in her small servant's quarters, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what Layla had revealed. The other ladies the child had mentioned were the previous nannies, women Ahmed had hired and fired with mechanical regularity, women who had left behind a trail of trauma that Layla was still carrying. Asha realized that the cameras weren't just invasive, they were enabling something far more sinister. Ahmed used the surveillance footage to monitor not just his employees' efficiency, but their interactions with his daughter, their moments of frustration or fatigue. Any nanny who grew too close to Layla, who might serve as a witness to whatever was happening in this house, was quickly replaced. The constant turnover ensured that Layla never had the chance to form lasting attachments, never had the opportunity to tell a trusted adult about the ways she was being hurt. The next morning, Asha began her investigation with the careful precision of someone who understood that one wrong move could result in deportation, unemployment, and the destruction of her family's future. She started documenting everything: the locations of cameras, the times when Ahmed reviewed footage, the patterns of behavior that had led to previous nannies being dismissed. She used her phone to take pictures of Layla's drawings, particularly the ones that showed dark figures looming over small children, the ones that depicted rooms with eyes watching from every corner. Most importantly, she began building trust with Layla, creating safe spaces where they could communicate without electronic surveillance. The walk-in closet in Layla's room had no cameras, and it was there, surrounded by expensive clothes the little girl never wore, that Asha learned the full scope of what had been happening. Layla's revelations came in fragments, whispered confessions that Asha had to piece together like a horrific puzzle. The previous nannies hadn't just been negligent. Some had been actively cruel, using their positions of power to inflict emotional and psychological abuse on a child who couldn't fight back or speak up. Ahmed's cameras had recorded it all, but instead of protecting his daughter, he had used the footage as evidence to justify firing the nannies, never acknowledging that his own system had enabled the abuse. The constant surveillance had created an environment where Layla felt simultaneously exposed and invisible, watched but not protected, recorded but not heard. She had learned to retreat into silence as the only form of privacy available to her, the only way to keep some part of herself safe from the electronic eyes that never stopped watching. The weight of this knowledge settled on Asha's shoulders like a physical burden, but with it came a clarity of purpose that burned away all her fears and doubts. She was not just a nanny anymore. She was a witness, a protector, a voice for a child who had been systematically silenced. Asha began planning her next moves with the strategic thinking of someone who had grown up poor and learned that survival required both patience and courage. She needed evidence that would be impossible for Ahmed to dismiss or cover up, proof that would force him to confront the consequences of his choices. But more than that, she needed to find a way to give Layla her voice back, to show the little girl that some adults could be trusted, that speaking truth to power was possible even when that power seemed absolute. The cameras that were meant to control and intimidate would become the instruments of Ahmed's awakening, and Layla's silence would finally be broken by the sound of justice demanding to be heard. Asha's plan began with the cameras themselves. If Ahmed wanted to watch everything, she would make sure he saw exactly what his surveillance system had enabled. She started positioning herself and Layla in direct view of the recording devices, creating situations where their conversations would be captured in high definition. During art therapy sessions, she encouraged Layla to draw her experiences while speaking about them aloud, ensuring that both the visual evidence and the verbal testimony would be preserved on Ahmed's own security system. "Tell me about this picture, sweetheart," Asha would say, knowing the cameras were recording. "Who is this person hurting the little girl?" Layla's responses were heartbreaking in their clarity. Detailed descriptions of emotional manipulation, psychological abuse, and the systematic destruction of a child's sense of safety, all preserved in digital format on servers that Ahmed monitored obsessively. The transformation in Layla was remarkable once she realized that Asha believed her, that her words had power and weight. The little girl who had been silent for months began speaking in torrents, as if years of suppressed communication were finally breaking free. She described nights when previous nannies had locked her in closets as punishment, days when they had withheld food to teach her discipline, moments when they had told her that her mother's death was her fault for being too difficult to love. Each revelation was captured by the very surveillance system that was supposed to protect her, creating an irrefutable record of systematic child abuse that had been happening under Ahmed's own roof. Asha made sure every conversation happened in view of the cameras, turning Ahmed's tool of control into an instrument of accountability. Meanwhile, Ahmed continued his nightly routine of reviewing security footage, fast-forwarding through hours of mundane domestic activity to check for any signs of employee misconduct. He noticed that the new nanny seemed unusually attentive to Layla, that his daughter appeared to be speaking more, but he attributed this to Asha's superior qualifications rather than any fundamental problem with his parenting approach. Ahmed had convinced himself that the previous nanny's failures were isolated incidents, character flaws in individuals rather than symptoms of a toxic system he had created. He fast-forwarded through most of Layla's art sessions, missing the content of her drawings and the significance of her words. The man who watched everything was seeing nothing that mattered, blinded by his own assumptions about his role as a father and protector. Asha also began documenting the psychological impact of constant surveillance on Layla's development. She encouraged the little girl to express her feelings about the cameras, to describe what it felt like to never have privacy, to always be watched and judged. "Sometimes I pretend I'm invisible," Layla told her during one recorded session. "I pretend the cameras can't see me, but they always can. Even when I'm sleeping, even when I'm sad, even when I want to be alone with my mommy's picture." The child's words were devastating in their insight, revealing how the surveillance had stripped away her sense of personal autonomy and created a chronic state of hypervigilance that was affecting her psychological development. Asha made sure these conversations happened where the cameras could capture them, building a case for emotional abuse that Ahmed himself was unknowingly compiling. The final piece of Asha's strategy involved creating a situation where Ahmed would be forced to watch the footage he had been ignoring. She arranged for Layla to have what appeared to be a breakdown during one of their sessions, a carefully orchestrated moment where the little girl would reveal everything she had been carrying: the abuse, the trauma, the fear, and the desperate need for a father who would protect rather than surveil. "I want my daddy to love me," Layla cried into the camera, her words echoing with the pain of a child who had been failed by every adult in her life. "I want him to make the cameras go away. I want him to make the hurt stop. I want him to believe me when I tell him what happened." The performance was heartbreaking because it wasn't really a performance. It was a little girl's genuine plea for love and protection, delivered directly to the father who had the power to provide both, but had chosen surveillance over connection, control over care. Ahmed was reviewing that night's footage when Layla's breakdown stopped him cold, her words cutting through his distraction like shards of glass. For the first time in months, he rewound the recording, watching his daughter's pain with the full attention he had never given her in person. The little girl's anguish was raw and real, but more troubling were her specific references to previous nannies, to incidents Ahmed had dismissed as disciplinary issues or personality conflicts. He began scrolling back through archived footage, looking for the conversations he had fast-forwarded through, the art sessions he had considered irrelevant. What he found shattered every assumption he had made about his daughter's life, his employees, and his own role as a father. Hours of recorded evidence showed systematic abuse happening under his own roof, captured by the very cameras he had installed for protection. The revelation hit Ahmed like a physical assault, each piece of evidence a blow to his carefully constructed self-image as a protective father. He watched footage of Layla being locked in dark rooms, saw nannies withholding food and affection, witnessed the systematic destruction of his daughter's spirit by people he had hired to care for her. But worse than the abuse itself was the realization that Layla had been trying to tell him for months. Through her drawings, her behavior, her desperate attempts to communicate her pain. The cameras had recorded everything, but he had been too focused on monitoring employee efficiency to notice his daughter's suffering. His surveillance system had become a monument to his failure as a father, a high-definition record of how badly he had failed the one person who mattered most. Ahmed's first instinct was rage at the nannies, at the agency, at everyone except himself. He called his lawyers, demanding prosecutions and investigations. But his legal team gently pointed out that his own footage showed he had been aware of troubling incidents and had chosen to fire employees rather than investigate further. The pattern of rapid turnover, combined with his obsessive surveillance, created a legal liability that extended far beyond wrongful termination. Moreover, Layla's psychological evaluation records, which Ahmed had ordered to address her behavioral problems, contained detailed documentation of trauma symptoms that any competent professional would have recognized as signs of abuse. Ahmed had been so focused on controlling his environment that he had become complicit in his daughter's victimization. As Ahmed continued reviewing months of archived footage, he began to understand the full scope of Asha's intervention. She hadn't just been caring for Layla. She had been systematically documenting abuse, giving his daughter a voice, and forcing him to confront truths he had been ignoring. Every conversation between Asha and Layla had been strategically positioned to be recorded, creating an undeniable record of his failures as a father. But more than that, the footage showed him something he had never seen before: his daughter's capacity for healing when she was treated with genuine love and respect. Under Asha's care, Layla was becoming the bright, articulate, joyful child she had always been beneath the trauma, proving that the behavioral problems Ahmed had tried to fix were actually symptoms of an environment he had created. The moment of true reckoning came when Ahmed found the footage of Layla's direct appeal to him, her tear-streaked face looking directly into the camera as she begged for a father who would love rather than surveil. "I want my daddy to love me," she had said, and Ahmed realized that despite all his wealth and power, Despite the elaborate security system and expensive therapists, he had never given his daughter the one thing she needed most: his presence, his attention, his unconditional love. The cameras that were supposed to protect her had become barriers between them, creating the illusion of oversight while enabling the very harm they were meant to prevent. Ahmed sat in his sterile office, surrounded by monitors and hard drives and digital evidence of his spectacular failure as a father. And for the first time since his wife's death, he allowed himself to cry. Not for his own pain, but for the childhood he had stolen from his daughter, for the trust he had betrayed, for the love he had been too afraid to give. The next morning, Ahmed did something unprecedented. He disconnected every camera in the apartment, personally removing each device and smashing them with a golf club in front of Layla, who watched with wide eyes as her father destroyed the electronic sentinels that had monitored her every moment. No more watching, he told her, his voice thick with emotion he had suppressed for too long. No more cameras, no more recording, no more strangers in our home. Just us. Layla looked uncertain at first, as if this might be another form of surveillance, a test to see how she would react to apparent freedom. But when Ahmed knelt down to her level and asked simply, "Will you forgive me?" the dam of silence that had protected her for so long finally burst completely. She flew into his arms with the force of a child who had been waiting years for permission to love her father without fear. Asha watched this reunion with tears in her eyes, knowing that her work was far from over, but that the most crucial battle had been won. Ahmed turned to her with the humility of someone who had been completely broken and was learning to rebuild from the foundation up. "You could have destroyed me," he said quietly. "You had enough evidence to ruin my reputation, my business, my life. Why didn't you?" Asha's response was simple and devastating in its honesty. "Because destroying you wouldn't heal her. She needs her father, not her father's destruction. She needs you to be better, not to be gone." The wisdom in her words revealed the depth of her understanding, not just of child psychology or trauma recovery, but of the fundamental truth that love requires presence, growth, and the courage to change. Ahmed's transformation began that day and continued with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. He fired his entire domestic staff, except for Asha, recognizing that Layla needed stability and consistency rather than a parade of temporary caregivers. He sold his business interests in 3 different countries to focus on being present for his daughter's recovery, understanding that no amount of wealth could compensate for an absent father. Most importantly, he began therapy, not for Layla's behavioral problems, but for his own trauma from losing his wife, his fear of emotional vulnerability, and his misguided belief that control could substitute for connection. The man who had once monitored every moment of his daughter's life now had to learn how to simply be with her, how to play and laugh and comfort without the mediation of technology. The healing process was neither quick nor easy. Layla still had nightmares, still flinched at sudden movements, still carried the scars of months of psychological abuse. But with Asha's guidance and Ahmed's newfound commitment to being an actual father rather than a distant provider, she began to blossom in ways that astonished everyone who knew her. She started painting pictures of families where the father was facing toward the children, houses with windows that let in sunlight, gardens where flowers grew freely without walls or barriers. Her laughter returned gradually, then abundantly, filling the apartment with a joy that no amount of surveillance equipment could have captured or quantified. Ahmed learned to braid her hair, to read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, to sit quietly when she needed to process difficult emotions rather than trying to fix or control her feelings. 6 months after the cameras came down, Ahmed made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He announced that he was establishing a foundation focused on protecting domestic workers, particularly women who traveled far from home to care for other people's families. The Al Rashid Foundation would provide legal protections, fair wages, safe working conditions, and pathways to citizenship for household employees who had previously been vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Asha was named as the foundation's director, with a salary that reflected both her qualifications and her invaluable contributions to his family's healing. But more than that, Ahmed created a network of support that would prevent other children from experiencing what Layla had endured and other nannies from facing the isolation and vulnerability that had made their suffering possible. The cameras that had once been instruments of oppression were replaced by systems of accountability that protected rather than exploited, that empowered rather than controlled. 2 years later, Layla was thriving in a way that would have seemed impossible during her months of silence. She had become fluent in 3 languages: English, Arabic, and Shwi, which Asha had taught her as a bridge to understanding different cultures and perspectives. Her artwork now adorned the walls of their home, bright and hopeful pieces that showed families playing together, children laughing without fear, and houses filled with light and love. She attended a progressive school where her teachers understood trauma-informed education, where her healing was supported by professionals who recognized that academic success meant nothing without emotional safety. Most importantly, she had a relationship with her father that was built on trust, communication, and genuine affection rather than surveillance and control. Ahmed had become an entirely different man, though the transformation hadn't erased his business acumen or leadership abilities. Instead, it had redirected those skills toward purposes that honored his daughter's suffering and Asha's courage. The Al Rashid Foundation had grown into an international organization that had helped thousands of domestic workers find safe employment, fair treatment, and legal protections. Ahmed spoke at conferences about corporate responsibility and child welfare, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing control over connection. He had learned that true power came not from the ability to monitor and manipulate, but from the capacity to love unconditionally and trust completely. His business empire remained profitable, but its purpose had been transformed from pure wealth accumulation to creating positive change in the world. Asha had become more than just Layla's nanny. She was family in every way that mattered. Ahmed had helped her bring her siblings to America, where they excelled in universities that had once seemed impossibly beyond their reach. Her youngest brother was studying pediatric medicine, inspired by his sister's example of how one person's courage could save a child's life. Asha herself had enrolled in a master's program in social work, preparing to expand her ability to help vulnerable children families. The foundation office was located in their apartment building, allowing her to maintain her close relationship with Layla while building a career that would impact thousands of other families. She had kept every one of Layla's drawings from the dark period, not as reminders of trauma, but as evidence of the human capacity for healing and growth. The apartment that had once been a maze of surveillance equipment was now filled with laughter, music, and the comfortable chaos of a family that actually enjoyed being together. Ahmed had learned to cook traditional Ghanaian dishes under Asha's guidance, and their dinner table featured conversations in multiple languages about school projects, foundation initiatives, and Layla's latest artistic creations. The little girl who had once been afraid to speak now chattered constantly about her friends, her dreams of becoming a teacher like Asha, and her plans to travel to Ghana to meet Asha's extended family. Ahmed listened to every word with the attention of someone who understood how precious ordinary moments could be, how much love could be communicated through simple presence and genuine interest. The transformation was so complete that visitors to their home often couldn't believe the stories about Ahmed's previous behavior. But Layla's artwork served as a visual timeline of their journey, from dark, frightening images to bright, hopeful scenes of family life. The wall in the hallway displayed this progression chronologically, a gallery that showed how love and patience could heal even the deepest wounds. Ahmed often stood before these pictures with tears in his eyes, marveling at his daughter's resilience and Asha's wisdom, grateful for the second chance he had almost been too blind to recognize. The cameras were gone, but the memories remained, not as surveillance footage to be reviewed and analyzed, but as lived experiences to be cherished and built upon. The story of their healing had reached far beyond their apartment, inspiring other wealthy families to examine their own relationships with their children and domestic employees. Ahmed received letters from fathers who had recognized themselves in his story, from mothers who had changed their approach to childcare after hearing Layla speak at foundation events. The little girl who had once been silenced by trauma had become a powerful voice for children's rights, speaking with the eloquence of someone who had been heard, believed, and loved back to wholeness. Asha's courage in speaking truth to power had not only saved one family, but had created ripples of change that would protect countless others. If this story moved you, maybe it's the sign you needed today. If it is, subscribe. The woman who had traveled 8,000 miles with nothing but hope and determination had not only transformed her own life, but had rebuilt a family from the ruins of surveillance and control. The cameras were gone, replaced by something far more powerful: the unblinking gaze of love, the constant recording of joy, and the eternal monitoring of a father's devotion to his daughter's happiness and well-being.